Most zombie movies begin when the dead rise. Shaun of the Dead begins somewhere much more disturbing, with the living. Before the first corpse stumbles into the frame, before the streets fill with blood, before anyone realizes that civilization is collapsing around them, Shaun is already surrounded by people who move, speak, work, shop, commute, drink and stare with the vacant rhythm of the undead. That is the first great joke of Edgar Wright's film, but it is also the film's most unsettling idea. The zombies are not what makes Shaun's world feel dead. They simply make the metaphor impossible to ignore. Look at the opening pub scenes and you can already see it. Tired faces, repetitive conversations, people gathered together without really connecting. Bodies occupying the same room while their minds drift somewhere else. Then compare those images with the actual zombies later, and the difference becomes almost meaningless. The same blank expressions, the same repetitive movements, the same directionless wandering, the same dependence on routine. The apocalypse does not create Shaun's problem. It exposes it. That is why the famous morning walk to the shop becomes such a perfect visual thesis statement. Shaun walks through his neighborhood exactly as he did the day before, following the same path, performing the same gestures, buying the same things, while the world around him has quietly transformed into a nightmare. Blood is visible. Emergency vehicles are moving. Strange figures are appearing in the distance. Yet Shaun barely registers any of it, because his attention is trapped inside the narrow tunnel of his own routine. The joke works because it is ridiculous. The horror works because it is recognizable. How many people move through their own mornings like this? Wake up, check the phone, commute, work, eat, scroll, drink, sleep, repeat. We call it adulthood because that sounds healthier than admitting how often we operate on autopilot. Shaun has simply taken that condition to its most literal extreme. He is not physically dead, but emotionally he has been sleepwalking through his own life for years. His job is going nowhere. His relationship with Liz is deteriorating. His friendship with Ed keeps him comfortable but prevents him from changing. Even the pub, which feels like a sanctuary, is really a hiding place from responsibility. And that gives Shaun of the Dead its central question: what is actually worse, becoming a zombie, or realizing you have already been living like one? The film answers by making the apocalypse strangely liberating. Once the ordinary rules disappear, Shaun finally has a reason to act. He has to choose. He has to lead. He has to protect people. He has to confront relationships he has spent years avoiding. The outbreak becomes horrifying, but it also becomes the first genuine wake-up call of his adult life. That contradiction is what makes the film so much more than a clever zombie parody. It is a story about awakening. And the deeper we look, the more we realize that almost every joke, every edit, every background detail, and eventually every death has been designed around that idea. To understand why it works so perfectly, we have to go backward, to the film's strange origins, its unlikely creative partnership, and the cinematic language that turned ordinary British boredom into one of the smartest horror comedies ever made. Because Shaun of the Dead is not simply a movie where comedy happens inside a zombie apocalypse. It is a movie where the comedy, the horror, the romance, and even the editing all emerge from the same central observation. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is not losing your life, but realizing you have stopped living it. From here, the journey through Shaun of the Dead becomes less like a conventional plot recap, and more like opening up a machine to see why every part moves at exactly the right moment. We will trace the film from its production origins and the unlikely spark that transformed a sitcom joke into a feature-length zombie story, then move through its screenplay architecture, examining how Shaun's personal failures are quietly converted into the mechanics of an apocalypse narrative. We will look at the psychology of Shaun, Liz, Ed, Philip, David, Barbara, and the rest of the ensemble because each character represents more than a source of jokes. Each one embodies a different relationship to adulthood, responsibility, fear, or stagnation. Then we will move beneath the dialogue into Wright's visual grammar, where whip pans, graphic matches, rapid inserts, repeated compositions, and precisely timed sound effects transform something as ordinary as making tea into a miniature action sequence. One of the most fascinating aspects of the film is how much information Wright hides inside apparently throwaway moments. Lines that sound like drunken nonsense later become plot instructions. Objects introduced as jokes become survival tools. Background movements quietly foreshadow future events. Even the film's color palette and recurring visual motifs are working long before the audience consciously realizes it. There are layers of setup planted throughout the first act that only become fully visible once the final act begins, which is why returning to the film after years can feel almost like watching it for the first time. The Three Flavors Cornetto connection also begins here, not simply as a running joke about ice cream, but as part of the creative identity that would eventually connect Shaun of the Dead with Hot Fuzz and The World's End. Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg were building a style in which genre was never treated as something beneath comedy. Instead, the genre became the foundation of the comedy. That distinction matters. A parody laughs at a genre from the outside. Shaun of the Dead loves the genre enough to understand its rules before breaking them. That is why the horror remains frightening even when the audience is laughing. And that balance explains why this 2004 film still feels surprisingly contemporary. Its zombies may belong to another era, but its emotional problem belongs to ours. We live in an age of constant notifications, endless productivity, repetitive digital routines, and social connection that can somehow make people feel more isolated. Shaun's world of landline phones, CRT televisions, local shops, and neighborhood pubs looks dated on the surface, but the emotional architecture underneath it has only become more familiar. The tools changed. The trap did not. And that is where nostalgia becomes something more interesting than simply remembering the early 2000s. For many viewers, Shaun of the Dead carries the smell of an old pub, the glow of a television in a dark room, the awkwardness of friendships that seemed permanent when you were younger, and the uncomfortable realization that adulthood has arrived without providing the instruction manual you expected. Shaun is not an extraordinary person trapped in an ordinary world. He is an ordinary person who suddenly discovers that the world requires something extraordinary from him. That fear is universal. What happens when you approach 30 and realize the life you assumed would eventually happen has not happened yet? What happens when a relationship survives on familiarity rather than genuine communication? What happens when your best friend is also the person who makes it easiest for you to remain exactly where you are? Ed is funny because he is immature, but the deeper reason he matters is that Shaun loves the version of himself that Ed allows him to be. Liz, meanwhile, represents the possibility of moving forward. She does not simply want Shaun to stop being funny or stop going to the pub. She wants him to be present. She wants evidence that he can participate in his own life. That distinction gives their breakup emotional weight. The problem is not that Shaun has hobbies or friendships. The problem is that he has confused comfort with happiness. For anyone who remembers the slacker culture of the early 2000s, the film's details can feel almost tactile. Bulky televisions, outdated video games, DVDs, cheap electronics, pub nights that stretch far beyond midnight, and the strange optimism of a generation standing between analog childhood and digital adulthood. But beneath all that nostalgia is a quieter anxiety. Friendships change. People move away. Relationships end. Jobs become careers by accident. The places that once felt permanent eventually become memories. Shaun of the Dead understands that growing up is not one dramatic event. It is a series of small moments when the old version of your life stops fitting. And if you have watched this film 10 times, you probably already know its biggest jokes. You know the records. You know the cricket bat. You know the Winchester. You know the red on Shaun's shirt. You know what happens to David. You know Ed's final fate. But the pleasure of returning to the film is discovering that knowing what happens does not destroy the experience. It improves it. Once the surprise disappears, the architecture becomes visible. A joke becomes foreshadowing. A background prop becomes evidence. A repeated phrase becomes a thematic motif. A camera movement becomes a narrative clue. The film rewards attention because it was constructed with attention. And before we can fully appreciate that construction, we need to understand where the entire idea came from. The story began not with a blockbuster pitch, but with a television comedy, a video game, and a very specific understanding of how horror could become funny without becoming disposable. The seed of Shaun of the Dead can be traced to Spaced, the cult British sitcom created by Simon Pegg and Jessica Hines, where Edgar Wright directed Pegg and the ensemble through a hyper-stylized comedy about young adults drifting through London. In the second season, the episode Art contains the crucial joke. Pegg's character Tim becomes convinced that a zombie attack is unfolding around him while playing Resident Evil 2. The premise was deliberately absurd, but Wright and Pegg noticed something bigger inside it. What if the joke did not end when the hallucination ended? What if the zombie movie itself could be taken seriously while the characters continued behaving like ordinary British people? That idea sounds simple now because the film made it feel inevitable. At the time, it was much stranger. The creative challenge was not merely to write jokes about zombies. It was to build a genuine zombie movie whose characters happened to be funny. Wright and Pegg understood that difference early. Their reference points were not only comedy films but the actual horror movies they admired, especially the work of George A. Romero. The dead in Shaun of the Dead are not decorative props. They are dangerous. The violence has weight. The rules of the genre matter. The film could mock zombie conventions only because it respected them first. That became the foundation of what the filmmakers jokingly called a rom-com, a romantic zombie comedy in which the apocalypse is inseparable from the breakup at the center of the story. The writing process grew out of Wright and Pegg's shared understanding of genre, British character comedy, and the rhythms they had developed on Spaced. They could take a mundane conversation and structure it like an action scene. They could introduce an apparently insignificant object and later turn it into a plot device. They could repeat a line until it became funny, then repeat it once more until it became tragic. The project also had to survive a marketplace that did not immediately understand what it was. A studio could understand a spoof, could understand a romantic comedy, could understand a zombie thriller. But a movie that wanted audiences to laugh at one moment, care deeply about a relationship the next, and then watch someone get torn apart by zombies was harder to classify. The filmmakers were effectively asking the industry to trust a tone that did not fit neatly into a single marketing category. The budget was modest by Hollywood standards, forcing the production to use real locations and practical solutions, rather than hiding behind enormous digital spectacle. That limitation ultimately became one of its greatest strengths. Working around London locations gave the film an unmistakably ordinary texture. These are not imaginary suburbs built to look vaguely British. They feel inhabited. Shops have names. Streets feel familiar. Houses have clutter. The Winchester looks like a place people actually drink in, not a generic movie pub design for a set piece. That realism makes the invasion more unsettling because the apocalypse is happening somewhere that looks almost exactly like the world outside the screen. The commitment to practical gore was equally important. Wright knew that if the film was going to ask audiences to accept the horror, the blood could not feel like a punchline. Prosthetics, makeup, physical effects, and controlled violence gave the deaths a tactile quality that digital effects might have weakened. The result was a strange hybrid. Visually playful, emotionally sincere, and physically disgusting when it needed to be. George A. Romero's approval became especially meaningful because the filmmakers were not simply borrowing the iconography of his movies. They were responding to it. Romero understood that zombie stories could carry social commentary beneath their genre surface, and Shaun of the Dead inherited that tradition while redirecting it toward British suburban life. Instead of a shopping mall becoming the symbol of consumer culture, the local pub becomes a sanctuary. Instead of military survivalists dominating the story, ordinary people attempt to navigate the collapse with household objects and incomplete information. Instead of presenting the apocalypse as an opportunity for macho transformation, the film asks whether an emotionally immature man can finally become responsible for the people around him. That specificity helped the movie stand out in the cinematic climate of 2004. The zombie genre was already changing. Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later had helped popularize the idea of fast-moving infected attackers, creating a sense of urgency very different from Romero's traditional slow walkers. Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake was also approaching the genre with modern action intensity. Audiences were becoming accustomed to zombies as kinetic threats rather than shambling metaphors. At the same time, comedy was saturated with broad parody. The success of films built around exaggerated genre references had created an appetite for spoofing, but it also created parody fatigue. The danger for Shaun of the Dead was obvious. It could easily have been marketed as another movie that simply pointed at zombie cliches and laughed. Instead, the filmmakers insisted on something more difficult. Play the horror straight, then find comedy inside the characters' reactions. Universal Pictures ultimately took a calculated gamble on the project, helping bring the film to an international audience, while allowing its distinctly British identity to remain intact. The marketing had an elegant challenge to solve. How do you explain a movie that is both a romantic comedy and a zombie film without making either side sound like a joke? The tagline, "A romantic comedy with zombies," did exactly that. It was simple, memorable, and honest. It told audiences what they were getting, while preserving the surprise of how effectively the two genres would overlap. Festival screenings and early word of mouth were crucial because the movie benefited from audiences telling other audiences that it was not merely another spoof. People came expecting laughs and discovered that the characters actually mattered. Horror fans came expecting zombie references and discovered that the film understood the genre. Comedy fans came for Simon Pegg and Nick Frost and discovered a story with real emotional consequences. That overlap became the film's secret weapon. Shaun of the Dead did not need to convince every audience that it belonged to them. It simply gave different audiences different doors through which they could enter. Once the film begins, the structure appears almost deceptively simple. Shaun is introduced not as a hero but as a man who has become trapped inside a life he barely examines. The Winchester is his comfort zone. Liz is his emotional reality check. Ed is his escape hatch. Forey Electronics is the place where his adult responsibilities exist without any sense of purpose. Even the opening conversations function like a map of the person Shaun has become. He is well-intentioned but inattentive, affectionate but passive, loyal but incapable of recognizing when loyalty has become an excuse for stagnation. His relationship with Liz has not collapsed because of one spectacular betrayal. It is eroding through accumulated disappointments. The forgotten anniversary and the failed dinner reservation are important precisely because they are small. Real relationships often break under the weight of repeated minor absences, rather than one cinematic catastrophe. Shaun keeps promising that things will change, but he has never developed the habits required to make change possible. Liz is therefore not asking for perfection. She is asking him to become present. At the same time, Shaun's home life reveals another layer of his immaturity. Ed treats the house like an extension of the pub, transforming shared living into an endless continuation of adolescence. Pete sees the problem immediately. His frustration is not merely about Ed being disgusting or irresponsible. He recognizes that Shaun is enabling the situation because confronting Ed would mean confronting himself. Shaun's job reinforces the same pattern. He occupies an adult workplace while behaving as though adulthood is something happening to other people. The younger employees around him create an uncomfortable contrast. Shaun is technically older, yet he often seems less mature. The film repeatedly places him between generations, unable to fully belong to either. That is why the pub matters so much. It is the one place where nobody expects him to evolve. There, he can remain Shaun indefinitely. Then Liz ends the relationship, and suddenly the routine that protected him becomes unbearable. Shaun and Ed respond in the most predictable way possible. They go to the Winchester. The irony is almost perfect. Shaun's solution to the collapse of his adult life is to return to the place that represents everything Liz believes he needs to outgrow. Yet while Shaun is drinking, the world outside is beginning to collapse. This is where Wright turns character psychology into visual comedy. The next morning, Shaun's walk to the shop is one of the film's defining sequences because the camera does not announce the apocalypse. It simply follows Shaun through the same routine. He buys his drink. He passes people. He hears fragments of strange noise. He notices almost nothing. The audience sees what he does not. The blood-stained windows, abandoned vehicles, emergency activity, and strange behavior in the background form a visual second narrative. The apocalypse is already there, but Shaun is still performing yesterday. This is visual storytelling at its purest. The film could have stopped and told us that Shaun is disconnected from reality. Instead, it lets us watch him demonstrate it. When he returns home, the first obvious zombie he encounters is not immediately treated as a monster. Mary appears in the garden behaving strangely, and Shaun and Ed initially interpret the situation through the logic they understand. Maybe she is drunk. Maybe she is ill. Maybe she is just some weird woman wandering around. The possibility that the dead have returned is so absurd that it is actually easier for them to misunderstand what they are seeing. This is the film's great tonal trick. Comedy delays recognition, and horror arrives the moment recognition becomes unavoidable. Once Mary attacks, the boys are forced to improvise. Their weapons are not heroic. They are whatever happens to be nearby. The cricket bat becomes an instrument of survival. Household objects become defensive tools. And the records become ammunition, creating one of the film's most memorable jokes because Shaun is forced to evaluate his own music collection under pressure. Even here, Wright is doing more than inserting a gag. The scene reveals character through objects. Shaun knows his records intimately. He cares about them. He has opinions about them. In an apocalypse, that knowledge suddenly becomes absurdly useful and absurdly irrelevant at the same time. Eventually, the reality becomes undeniable. The world has collapsed and Shaun finally develops something he has lacked for most of the story. A plan. The plan is ridiculous, but its existence marks a psychological turning point. Take Pete's car. Rescue Barbara. Deal with Philip if necessary. Get Liz and her friends. Go to the Winchester. Have a nice cold pint and wait for all this to blow over. The brilliance of the plan is that it is simultaneously practical and childish. Shaun has finally decided to take responsibility, but he still defines safety through the language of comfort. The Winchester remains at the center of his imagined solution, because he cannot yet envision adulthood without familiar escape routes. Wright then turns the plan itself into a miniature editing symphony. Information is repeated. Actions are compressed. Future events are visually planted. The audience is allowed to laugh at Shaun's confidence, while the structure quietly prepares us for the fact that his plan will cost him more than he expects. The rescue of Barbara and Philip intensifies that tension. Philip, who has often appeared to Shaun as an irritating authority figure, is bitten and begins to die. But the bite forces Shaun to confront something he has avoided. Philip is not simply the man who replaced his biological father. He is a father figure who desperately wants a relationship with him. His final moments strip away the defensive hostility between them. The reconciliation is brief because the film understands that some emotional truths arrive only when there is almost no time left to express them. Philip's death therefore becomes an early warning that Shaun's growth will not be painless. He can become better, but he cannot undo the years he wasted. Once the group forms, the movie becomes a social pressure cooker. Liz arrives with David and Diane, bringing a different dynamic into Shaun's world. David immediately challenges Shaun's authority, partly because Shaun has not earned unquestioned leadership, and partly because David is threatened by the emotional history between Shaun and Liz. Diane brings humor and unexpected usefulness, while Ed remains the chaotic center of the group. The Peugeot becomes a moving laboratory for these personalities, forcing people who would normally avoid one another into the same confined space. Wright understands that zombie stories become interesting when the real threat is not merely outside the group, but inside its relationships. The undead may want to eat them, but jealousy, resentment, grief, fear, and insecurity determine how the survivors behave. The meeting with Yvonne's group creates a subtle visual joke and thematic mirror. Another group of survivors is moving through the same apocalypse, yet their formation seems cleaner, calmer, more competent. It is a glimpse of what Shaun's group might have looked like if its members had not spent so much time avoiding one another. That comparison becomes important because Shaun's real journey is not about becoming the strongest person in the room. It is about becoming someone capable of holding a group together despite his own weaknesses. Eventually they reach the Winchester, the place Shaun has imagined as the ultimate refuge. But the pub is locked. Even the sanctuary he has spent the entire movie relying upon refuses to welcome him. Shaun must climb, improvise, and break into the building. Symbolically, that matters. The place that once represented effortless comfort now requires effort to enter. When they finally get inside, the group attempts to recreate normality. This is one of the film's funniest and saddest ideas. Outside, civilization is collapsing. Yet inside the Winchester, people debate what to do, drink, argue, and try to maintain familiar routines. Shaun has escaped the world, but he has not escaped the habits that made him unhappy in the first place. Then comes the Queen sequence, a moment so precisely constructed that it demonstrates why Wright's filmmaking cannot be separated from his comedy. Don't Stop Me Now begins playing, and the pool cues become weapons. Every movement is synchronized to the rhythm. Every hit lands with musical precision. Props become choreography. The room becomes a geometric playground. The scene is hilarious because the editing treats the fight as an ecstatic musical performance. But the danger never disappears completely. That is Wright's method in miniature. The joke does not cancel the threat. It intensifies it by making the violence more controlled, more memorable, and more shocking. Then the emotional floor drops out. Barbara reveals that she has been bitten. The woman Shaun spent the film trying to rescue cannot be saved. The group's laughter disappears, replaced by denial, panic, and grief. Shaun has been building toward this moment without knowing it. He wanted to become responsible because he wanted to save everyone. The apocalypse teaches him the harder lesson. Responsibility does not guarantee success. Sometimes doing everything you can still ends with loss. David reacts badly, and his breakdown reveals the weakness underneath his intellectual confidence. He has spent much of the film criticizing Shaun, presenting himself as the more mature alternative. But when the situation becomes unbearable, his composure collapses. His confrontation with Shaun is not simply a conflict over leadership. It is a clash between two different kinds of masculinity. David performs competence. Shaun gradually develops it. David wants to be seen as the rational adult. Shaun becomes one by accepting emotional responsibility. When the zombies finally break through the windows, the distinction becomes physical. David's attempt to escape ends in one of the film's most brutal sequences, with the horror suddenly overwhelming the comedy. The tonal shift can be shocking on a first viewing, but it is also necessary. The movie has spent more than an hour teaching us to laugh at the apocalypse. Now it forces us to remember that people are actually dying. The consequences cannot remain weightless forever. The climax traps Shaun, Liz, and Ed in the burning cellar. For Shaun, the final location is almost perversely appropriate. The pub that represented his comfort zone is literally collapsing around him. There is nowhere left to hide inside the identity he built for himself. Ed is bitten and dying. Liz is beside him. The world above is being consumed by fire and zombies. At this point, Shaun no longer has a clever plan. He has only the people he loves and the truth he has spent the entire movie avoiding. His farewell with Ed is therefore devastating because their friendship has always been built around avoidance. They joke. They drink. They play games. They refuse to discuss the future. Now the future has disappeared, and Shaun finally tells Ed what he means to him. The emotional honesty arrives only when there is no room left for performance. Then the cellar lift provides an escape, creating one last reversal. The movie does not reward Shaun with a perfect heroic victory. It simply gives him another chance to live differently. The military arrives, the outbreak is contained, and the film treats this resolution with deliberately understated absurdity. There is something almost bureaucratic about the way civilization reasserts itself. The apocalypse has not ended because Shaun defeated the undead army. It ends because institutions eventually catch up. 6 months later, the world has adjusted. Zombies are still around, but society has domesticated them. They become cheap labor, entertainment, and background spectacle. The apocalypse has become content. This epilogue is funny, but its satire is sharper than it first appears. Humanity does not simply survive disasters, it monetizes them. What was once terrifying becomes television. What was once monstrous becomes useful. The final image of Ed living in Shaun's shed completes the contradiction. Shaun has matured, but he has not abandoned his friend. Ed remains part of his life, only now within boundaries. They can still play video games together. They can still joke. But Shaun is no longer allowing friendship to determine the entire shape of his life. That balance becomes the emotional key to the character. He does not need to become a completely different person. He needs to become a more responsible version of himself. And that transformation is why Shaun works as an anti-hero, rather than a conventional action protagonist. His external objective seems straightforward: get Liz back. But underneath that goal is a deeper need to confront adulthood. Shaun wants the relationship because he loves Liz, but he also needs the relationship to force him to recognize what he has been avoiding. His journey is therefore not from coward to warrior. It is from passive observer to active participant. At the beginning, Shaun allows events to happen around him. At the end, he makes decisions even when those decisions hurt. That difference is the real measure of courage. The symbolic objects around him reinforce the transformation. His name tag represents the repetitive identity of his job, a tiny label reducing him to a function. His red tie becomes part of the visual language of blood and responsibility. The cricket bat initially looks like a ridiculous household weapon, but it becomes a symbol of Shaun adapting the tools of ordinary British life to extraordinary circumstances. He does not suddenly become an American action hero carrying a massive rifle. He remains British, awkward, underprepared, and recognizable. That is important because Shaun's heroism never comes from becoming someone else. It comes from finally becoming himself with intention. His psychological wounds are also rooted in family. The absence of his biological father and the complicated relationship with Philip leave Shaun with an unresolved idea of masculinity and authority. Philip seems cold and demanding, but his final scenes reveal how much affection he has been trying to express beneath that surface. Shaun has spent years interpreting guidance as criticism because accepting Philip as a father figure would require vulnerability. His reconciliation with Philip therefore arrives too late to repair the past, but not too late to reveal its truth. That is one of the film's recurring tragedies. Shaun often recognizes what matters only when circumstances remove the possibility of taking it for granted. The zombies themselves function as an external force, rather than a conventional villain. They are terrifying because they have no individual motivation. They simply move, consume, and repeat. In that sense, they represent the physical manifestation of apathy. They are what people become when desire, curiosity, and individuality have been stripped away. David, however, operates as a more personal antagonist. He is human, articulate, apparently intelligent, and emotionally compromised. He presents himself as mature while being driven by insecurity and jealousy. His hostility toward Shaun is partly rooted in the fact that Liz's emotional history with Shaun makes him feel like an outsider. David wants to replace Shaun, but he also wants to prove that he is better than him. That combination makes his character interesting because his greatest weakness is not stupidity. It is the need to be perceived as superior. When pressure becomes unbearable, the performance collapses. Shaun, by contrast, begins the film looking inferior and ends it demonstrating genuine courage. The difference is not intelligence. It is authenticity. Philip occupies an even more complicated position. For much of the first act, Shaun treats him as an obstacle. Yet Philip's final moments reveal a man who has spent years trying to connect with a son who refuses to see him clearly. His death changes how we interpret their earlier conflict. The film does not magically erase the tension between them, but it allows Shaun to recognize the humanity behind it. That recognition is part of growing up. Understanding that the adults who frustrated you were also imperfect people trying to navigate their own fears. The supporting cast extends this psychological map. Ed represents pure comfort, instinct, and childhood. He is funny because he refuses to grow up, but he is also dangerous because he makes it easy for Shaun to remain stagnant. Yet calling Ed simply toxic would miss the emotional truth of their friendship. Ed genuinely loves Shaun. His loyalty is real. His problem is that loyalty without growth can become a cage. Liz represents the opposite pressure. She is not demanding that Shaun abandon his personality. She is demanding emotional presence. She wants him to participate in a relationship instead of simply occupying one. Barbara represents maternal comfort, the familiar emotional world Shaun desperately wants to preserve. Her death forces him to understand that protection cannot mean preventing change. Diane offers another variation, transforming theatrical training into unexpected survival skills. Her ability to perform becomes useful because the apocalypse itself becomes a stage on which everyone must improvise. These characters work because the film gives them distinct rhythms. Pegg and Frost are particularly effective together because their chemistry feels lived in rather than constructed. Their conversations sound like two friends who have repeated the same jokes for years. That authenticity allows the film to move from absurd comedy to genuine grief without feeling manipulative. The audience believes that Shaun loves Ed because the friendship feels real before the story asks us to mourn it. Underneath the plot is a much larger thematic argument about routine. The film suggests that routine itself is not evil. Routines can provide stability, comfort, and meaning. The danger comes when routine becomes an excuse to avoid living. Shaun's daily life is full of repeated actions that have lost their purpose. He works without ambition. He drinks without celebration. He dates without communicating. He spends time with Ed without asking whether their friendship is helping either of them grow. The zombies exaggerate this condition until it becomes impossible to ignore. Their endless wandering is the perfect image of life without intention. They are not choosing where to go. They are simply moving because that is what they do. Modern audiences can recognize that condition even without zombies. The smartphone era has made repetition almost invisible because the distractions change constantly, while the underlying behavior remains the same. Scroll, refresh, respond, consume, repeat. The technology in Shaun of the Dead may look ancient now, but the psychological problem has become more sophisticated. That is why the movie's critique of apathy has aged so well. It also offers a more complicated view of male friendship. Shaun and Ed love each other, but love alone does not guarantee that a friendship is healthy. Sometimes friends protect one another from loneliness, while also protecting one another from growth. The question is whether friendship can evolve without losing its identity. Shaun's ending suggests that it can. He does not abandon Ed. He changes the conditions of their relationship. That distinction is crucial. Adulthood is not presented as becoming boring. It is presented as becoming accountable. You can still play games. You can still go to the pub. You can still love the friends who knew you before you had everything figured out. But you also have to answer the phone. Keep promises. Show up. Make decisions. Accept consequences. The Winchester embodies the illusion of safety. Shaun believes that if he can reach the pub, everything will be okay. But the pub is not safe because it allows him to avoid reality. It becomes the site of the final battle precisely because comfort cannot remain untouched by change. The objects of the film carry similar symbolic weight. Red appears again and again, most obviously in the recurring phrase about having red on you. At first, the line functions as a joke, a casual observation about blood or clothing. Over time, it becomes connected to the physical evidence of Shaun's transformation. Red is embarrassment, violence, danger, blood, and responsibility. Shaun cannot move through the apocalypse without getting something on him. He cannot grow without consequences becoming visible. Mirrors and windows create another recurring visual idea. Shaun frequently looks through glass or is framed by reflective surfaces, creating images of separation between himself and the world. Windows become barriers that later become entry points for zombies. Mirrors offer distorted self-recognition. Shaun is repeatedly placed in situations where he can see what is happening without fully understanding what he is seeing. That visual distance reflects his psychological condition. The cricket bat and Winchester rifle also establish a cultural contrast. American action cinema often gives its heroes oversized weapons that instantly communicate power. Shaun gets a cricket bat, an object associated with ordinary British leisure. The joke is that British survival looks less glamorous, but the deeper meaning is that Shaun never becomes a different kind of hero. His tools remain connected to the world he knows. Even fences become symbolic. Shaun repeatedly encounters barriers that look physically simple, but psychologically significant. Jumping over a fence is easy until the moment you have spent your entire life avoiding obstacles, rather than confronting them. The movie's deeper cultural commentary extends beyond individual psychology into British identity. There is a recognizable satire of the national instinct to remain composed during catastrophe. Keep calm. Be polite. Have tea. Go to the pub. Avoid making a scene. Shaun of the Dead exaggerates this attitude until it becomes absurd. The apocalypse is happening, yet characters still worry about social etiquette, inconvenience, and whether they should disturb the neighbors. This is funny because it reflects a cultural stereotype, but it also carries a serious observation. Politeness can become a form of denial when reality demands action. The media satire pushes the idea further. News broadcasts reduce the disaster into information fragments, while the public consumes the crisis from a distance. Later, once zombies have been integrated into society, the catastrophe becomes entertainment. The undead are no longer existential threats. They are content workers' curiosities. Capitalism has absorbed the apocalypse and found a use for it. The final image of Ed in the shed is therefore more ambiguous than it appears. On one level, it is sweet. Shaun has kept his friend alive and maintained their bond. On another, it suggests that stagnation never disappears completely. You can manage it. You can contain it. You can even make peace with it. But it remains there waiting in the shed. That is an existential idea disguised as a sitcom ending. Human beings spend their lives trying to balance freedom with comfort, change with identity, responsibility with pleasure. Shaun does not solve that problem permanently. He simply becomes more conscious of it. Edgar Wright's visual language makes these ideas work because the film rarely explains itself when it can show something instead. His editing style has become so recognizable that it is often described simply as the Wright style. But its power comes from precision rather than speed alone. Whip pans are not used merely because they look energetic. They connect ideas. Close-ups do not simply emphasize props. They establish visual promises. Sound effects transform ordinary actions into miniature pieces of choreography. A hand reaches for a light switch, a kettle clicks, a door closes, a record spins, a phone rings, and suddenly the rhythm of everyday life becomes the rhythm of an action sequence. This technique has roots in silent comedy, particularly performers such as Buster Keaton, who could build entire jokes through spatial relationships and precise physical timing. Wright also works like a comic book artist, filling the frame with information that rewards the viewer for looking again. The background is rarely dead space. Something can be happening behind Shaun while he is focused on something completely different. That layering creates comedy without dialogue, because the audience knows more than the character. It also creates suspense because the same visual grammar can shift from funny to threatening, without changing its basic mechanics. One of the clearest examples is Ed's drunken speech in the pub, where he casually predicts elements of the story that later occur. On a first viewing, it sounds like nonsense. After the film ends, it sounds like prophecy. That is not accidental. Wright and Pegg understand that repetition creates expectation, and expectation creates both comedy and suspense. When a line returns in a new context, the audience experiences two emotions simultaneously: recognition and surprise. This is why the screenplay feels so tightly constructed. Information is rarely wasted. The visual jokes are also designed around action rather than explanation. Instead of telling us that Shaun's life is repetitive, Wright repeats compositions. Instead of telling us that the apocalypse is approaching, he places it in the background. Instead of telling us that the group is losing control, he changes the spatial relationship between characters. The result is a film that can be funny even when watched without dialogue. The physical design of scenes communicates personality, tension, and narrative progression. That discipline extends to the production design and practical effects. Shooting in real London neighborhoods gives the movie an authenticity that digital environments would have weakened. Crouch End, New Cross, Wood Green, and surrounding locations provide the ordinary texture required for the story's central contrast. The streets do not look like an apocalypse movie. They look like streets. That is precisely why the zombies are disturbing when they appear. Practical special effects give the violence weight. The blood looks physical. The wounds look painful. The gore has texture. David's death is not a cartoon. It is horrifying, even as the sequence retains Wright's stylized sense of movement. That commitment to physical reality prevents the comedy from floating away from consequence. Lighting also changes with the narrative. Early scenes have a relatively flat, everyday quality, matching Shaun's emotional numbness. As the story progresses into the Winchester siege, the lighting becomes more contrast-heavy and claustrophobic. Spaces shrink. Shadows deepen. The familiar pub becomes threatening. The bright ordinary world of the first act gradually gives way to the enclosed nightmare of the final act. This visual progression mirrors Shaun's psychological transformation. The world becomes darker because he can no longer hide from what is happening. Music plays a similar role. The score by Daniel Mudford and Pete Woodhead draws from the traditions of horror music, including the synthetic tension associated with John Carpenter and the genre atmosphere associated with Goblin and Dawn of the Dead. The crucial point is that the score does not laugh at the horror. It takes danger seriously. That seriousness makes the comedy stronger. If the music constantly told us that every zombie moment was a joke, the audience would never feel the threat. Instead, the score often behaves as though we are watching a conventional horror film. The comedy comes from the mismatch between that serious musical language and the ordinary behavior of the characters. Shaun may be trying to survive the end of civilization, but the music can make the moment feel like a genuine nightmare. When the emotional stakes rise, the music becomes more melancholic, giving Shaun and Liz's relationship a sense of regret and unfinished business. Their story is not simply a romantic subplot. It is the emotional engine that determines whether Shaun can change. The licensed songs add another layer of identity. Queen's Don't Stop Me Now transforms the Winchester fight into a piece of musical choreography, while other tracks help establish the film's British cultural atmosphere. Sound effects are equally important. The clicks, thuds, swishes, impacts, and squelches are exaggerated just enough to make physical comedy land. Wright understands that sound can create a joke before the audience processes the image. The vinyl selection scene is a perfect example. The records are suddenly treated like tactical equipment, and the sound of each one being handled gives the decision absurd importance. Even the ambient radio and television broadcasts contribute to the atmosphere. They create a layer of information outside the character's awareness, reminding us that the world is changing even when Shaun is not paying attention. This careful sound design is one reason the film remains so satisfying to rewatch. The film's release in 2004 quickly revealed that the gamble had worked. What could have been dismissed as a niche British experiment found an audience through word of mouth, critical enthusiasm, and genre credibility. Horror fans were particularly important because the film demonstrated that its jokes came from affection rather than contempt. It knew the rules of zombie cinema. It understood Romero. It knew how a zombie movie was supposed to feel. That gave audiences permission to laugh without feeling that the genre itself was being mocked. High-profile support from figures such as Quentin Tarantino, Peter Jackson, and Romero helped reinforce the film's legitimacy among cinephiles and horror communities. Romero's later decision to involve Pegg and Wright in Land of the Dead became an especially fitting acknowledgement. The creators who had once borrowed from his work were now being welcomed into its world. Early internet culture also played a role. Before social media had become the dominant engine of entertainment discovery, forums, genre websites, and fan communities could turn an unexpected movie into an international conversation. Shaun of the Dead benefited from exactly that kind of grassroots enthusiasm. People did not simply say that it was funny. They told others that it was different. That distinction mattered. The film eventually earned a strong critical reputation, and its standing only grew with time. The audience discovered what later generations would recognize immediately. The movie is built to reward both emotional investment and technical attention. Its influence can be seen across modern horror comedy. Zombieland followed with its own combination of zombie survival and character humor. What We Do in the Shadows pushed the mockumentary approach to supernatural comedy. Other films and television series adopted increasingly kinetic editing, genre-aware humor, and characters who could exist simultaneously inside and outside the conventions they were inhabiting. The influence extends into digital media as well. The rapid cuts, visual callbacks, rhythmic editing, and compressed storytelling that once felt distinctive in cinema became part of the grammar of online video. Yet Shaun of the Dead still feels different because its speed serves character rather than simply attention. Every fast cut is telling us something about Shaun, Ed, or the group. Every repeated joke changes meaning. That is why the film's quotes remain alive decades later. "You've got red on you," "fried gold," "the Winchester," "the records," "the Queen scene." These are not merely memes because the moments are connected to character and structure. A meme can survive through repetition, but a cinematic moment survives because it means something every time you return to it. The Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy further strengthened the film's legacy. Shaun of the Dead established a creative partnership that would continue through Hot Fuzz and The World's End, with each film using genre as a framework for exploring friendship, masculinity, adulthood, community, and cultural identity. That pattern is one of the most impressive achievements of Wright and Pegg's collaboration. The movies are funny enough to work as comedies, but their genre structures give them room to say something larger. Shaun uses zombies to discuss stagnation. Hot Fuzz uses action cinema to discuss community and institutional complacency. The World's End uses science fiction to discuss aging and resistance to change. Seen together, the trilogy becomes a portrait of adulthood disguised as genre entertainment. Critical debate around Shaun of the Dead has always been relatively minor compared with its overall acclaim, but the disagreements are useful because they reveal what the film is attempting. Some viewers initially approached it expecting a pure spoof, a British version of the broad genre parodies popular at the time. That expectation could make the emotional material seem unexpectedly serious. But the seriousness is precisely why the comedy works. If Shaun and Liz's relationship did not matter, the breakup would be just another setup for jokes. If Barbara's death did not matter, the final act would have no emotional consequence. If Ed were only comic relief, his death would not hurt. The film earns its tonal shifts because it spends so much time building genuine relationships before destroying them. Horror purists also had reason to respect the movie because the gore is not softened to protect the comedy. Zombies are dangerous. People die. The rules remain consistent. The movie does not require audiences to choose between laughing and being scared. It asks them to experience both. Over 20 years, that balance has become easier to appreciate because the film's structure has aged better than many contemporary comedies. Its jokes are not dependent entirely on references that disappear with time. Its character conflicts are recognizable. Its editing remains inventive. Its emotional beats still land. The criticisms that do exist are worth taking seriously. The transition into the third act is undeniably sharp. Characters who have survived for most of the movie suddenly die in rapid succession, changing the emotional temperature from absurdity to grief. Some viewers find that jarring, but the alternative would be to protect the characters from consequences, which would undermine the film's central argument about waking up to reality. The apocalypse cannot remain harmless simply because the audience likes the characters. Ed creates an even more interesting debate. Shaun's final decision to keep zombified Ed in the shed can be interpreted as a beautiful statement about friendship, or as evidence that Shaun has not completely escaped his old patterns. Has he matured if he still preserves the relationship in such an unconventional form? The answer may be deliberately unresolved. Growth does not mean erasing every part of your old self. It means deciding how those parts fit into the life you are building. The military rescue is another controversial element. Some viewers see it as a convenient deus ex machina. Others recognize that its abruptness is part of the satire. After spending the entire movie watching ordinary people struggle while institutions appear absent, the arrival of the military feels almost absurdly efficient. That contrast is the joke. Society eventually returns not through heroic individualism but through systems doing what systems do once they finally mobilize. The Winchester siege itself can also feel longer than the earlier sections, because the film intentionally slows down to allow relationships to fracture. That pause is important. The movie is no longer primarily about escaping zombies. It is about forcing characters to confront one another. The siege becomes emotional before it becomes physical. Financially, Shaun of the Dead was an impressive demonstration of what a relatively modest production could accomplish when creative identity became part of the selling point. With a budget often reported around $6 million, the film generated more than $30 million worldwide and developed a substantial afterlife through home entertainment. The mid-2000s DVD market was particularly important because movies could continue generating meaningful revenue long after theatrical release. Shaun benefited from repeat viewing, and repeat viewing was exactly where its dense construction became an asset. The more people watched it, the more details they discovered. That created a long-term value far beyond the initial box office. The success also demonstrated that distinctly British comedy could travel internationally without being stripped of its local identity. Shaun does not become generic for American audiences. The accents, pubs, neighborhoods, cultural references, and social behavior remain specific. Yet the emotional story is universal enough to cross borders. That combination became valuable for the filmmakers and the studios supporting them. Edgar Wright's career expanded dramatically after the film. Simon Pegg became associated with major international franchises, while Nick Frost developed into a recognizable comedy presence. Wright would eventually direct projects such as Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Baby Driver, bringing the same obsession with rhythm, editing, genre, and visual storytelling into very different cinematic worlds. Pegg would become part of Star Trek and Mission Impossible, proving that the performer introduced to many viewers as an awkward British everyman could operate inside enormous global franchises. Shaun of the Dead did not simply make its creators famous. It demonstrated that a distinctive voice could become a commercial asset. That was an important industry lesson. The film was not built around focus group-tested jokes or anonymous visual polish. Its identity came from the filmmakers. The success suggested that studios could benefit from trusting directors and writers who understood exactly what made their work unusual. That influence can be seen in the careers that followed, and in the willingness of later productions to embrace directors with highly recognizable styles. Historically, Shaun of the Dead occupies an unusual place in British cinema. It inherits the tradition of British comedy that values character, social observation, and cultural specificity, while simultaneously embracing modern genre filmmaking. In that sense, it forms a bridge between older British comedy traditions and the fast, visually sophisticated language of contemporary cinema. Its relationship with films from Ealing Studios and the spirit of Monty Python is not direct imitation, but there is a shared willingness to find comedy inside ordinary British life. The difference is that Wright brings this sensibility into a postmodern genre framework. Instead of making the pub, neighborhood, or workplace the entire world, he places those environments inside an apocalypse movie. that makes the ordinary feel extraordinary without destroying its ordinary character. The film's recognition through major British awards and its continuing presence on respected film lists helped establish its long-term status. More importantly, it became one of the defining genre films of the 2000s, arriving before the massive television expansion of zombie culture that would later make the undead a permanent part of mainstream entertainment. It helped demonstrate that zombie stories could be funny, romantic, political, emotional, and visually inventive at the same time. It also established a visual precedent for modern cinematic parody. The film does not merely imitate another genre's surface. It reproduces the grammar of the genre so accurately that the parody becomes indistinguishable from genuine participation. That is why it has aged so well. The technology is dated. The emotional architecture is not. The CRT televisions, flip phones, early gaming references, DVDs, and other details clearly belong to 2004. Someone watching today may notice how physically different communication was. The world before smartphones required more attention to landlines, television broadcasts, and physical locations. Yet these dated details also contribute to the film's charm. They freeze the story in a specific cultural moment without making its themes obsolete. The practical gore still works because physical effects have texture. The visual comedy still works because timing does not age. Shaun and Liz's relationship still works because emotional neglect does not require a particular technology. The friendship between Shaun and Ed still works because people continue to outgrow one another and fear what that means. Even the game references become part of the nostalgia rather than a barrier to understanding. What makes the film especially rewarding is its rewatch value. Once you know where the story ends, the opening becomes more revealing. You notice how many jokes are actually instructions. You notice how many objects are introduced before they become important. You hear dialogue differently because you understand what it predicts. The first viewing asks, "What happens next?" Later viewings ask, "How did they hide that in plain sight?" That is the difference between a disposable comedy and a carefully engineered screenplay. The film also continues to reach younger audiences because its central conflict is not tied to one generation. Gen Z and younger viewers may not share every technological reference, but they understand the feeling of being trapped in repetitive routines. They understand uncertainty about adulthood. They understand the comfort of friendships that may no longer fit. They understand the desire to escape responsibility and the fear of discovering that escape has become a lifestyle. The details change. The emotional problem survives. And that brings us to the final assessment. If Shaun of the Dead were simply a clever zombie parody, its influence would probably have faded as the genre evolved. Instead, it became more valuable with age because its craftsmanship became easier to see. The screenplay is remarkably tight. Setups pay off. Character flaws drive plot events. Visual jokes carry thematic meaning. The editing creates rhythm without sacrificing clarity. The music respects the horror. The gore respects the consequences. Most importantly, the emotional story never disappears beneath the technique. Shaun changes. Liz changes. Ed remains himself, but his role in Shaun's life changes. Philip's relationship with Shaun changes through loss. Barbara's death transforms the meaning of family. David's failure exposes the difference between appearing mature and actually accepting responsibility. Nearly every major character movement reinforces the same central question. Are you participating in your life or merely moving through it? There are flaws. Some tonal transitions are abrupt. The final rescue is intentionally convenient. A few character decisions can feel exaggerated, but those weaknesses are small compared with the precision of the overall construction. The movie understands exactly what it wants to be. It does not compromise its horror to become a comedy, and it does not suppress its comedy to become a horror film. It allows both to exist because both emerge from the same human truth. That is why a 1010 rating is not simply nostalgia speaking. Shaun of the Dead is a genre-defining romantic horror comedy because it achieves something that is much harder than making people laugh or making them care. It makes the laughter deepen the emotion and the emotion deepen the laughter. It makes the violence meaningful without becoming miserable. It makes the romance believable without becoming sentimental. It makes the apocalypse entertaining without making it empty. And at the center of all that craft is a very simple idea. The real monster was never just the zombie. The real monster was the life Shaun had accepted without questioning. A life where tomorrow always looked like today. A life where responsibility could be postponed because there was always another night at the Winchester. A life where love could be assumed rather than maintained. A life where friendship meant staying exactly the same because changing might mean losing the person you used to be. The apocalypse destroys that illusion. It forces Shaun to understand that comfort is not the same thing as happiness, and survival is not the same thing as living. He does not become heroic because he learns how to swing a cricket bat. He becomes heroic because he finally decides that other people matter enough to act for them. That is the deeper lesson of the film. Growing up does not mean becoming boring. It does not mean abandoning the people who made your younger years meaningful. It does not mean destroying every childish part of yourself in the name of responsibility. It means learning which parts of yourself deserve to come with you. Shaun keeps his humor. He keeps his friendship with Ed. He keeps his love of the pub and his video games. But he also learns to communicate, to protect, to make decisions, and to accept consequences. That is a much more honest definition of adulthood than the one most coming-of-age stories provide. You do not wake up one morning and suddenly become complete. You simply begin noticing the ways you have been asleep. And maybe that is why the opening image of Shaun walking through a world he cannot see remains so powerful after all these years. At the beginning, the zombies are already among the living because nobody has noticed how repetitive life has become. At the end, Shaun is still imperfect, still funny, still surrounded by traces of the old world, but he is awake. The apocalypse did not give him a new life. It forced him to recognize the one he already had. And perhaps we do not need an apocalypse to make that realization. Maybe the warning is much quieter. Maybe it is the morning when you realize you have been doing the same thing for years. Maybe it is the friendship that survives only because neither person wants to admit it has changed. Maybe it is the relationship where love exists but presence does not. Maybe it is the job that consumes every weekday, while promising a future that never arrives. Maybe it is the phone glowing in your hand at midnight while another hour disappears. We all have our own version of the Winchester. A place, habit, relationship, or routine that feels safe because it asks nothing new from us. Shaun of the Dead does not tell us to destroy those comforts. It asks us to recognize them, because there is nothing wrong with enjoying the familiar. The danger begins when the familiar becomes the only place where we are willing to live. Shaun eventually learns that lesson. He loses people. He makes mistakes. He is frightened. He fails. But he keeps moving. And perhaps that is the final reason this strange little British zombie comedy became so enduring. beneath the blood, jokes, records, cricket bats, pubs, and perfectly timed edits, it is a story about the terrifying possibility that life can pass while you are waiting to begin it. So if you return to Shaun of the Dead after this analysis, do not only watch for the jokes you already know. Watch the background. Watch the reflections. Listen to the throwaway dialogue. Notice the objects that seem meaningless. Look at Shaun before he understands what is happening, and then look at him after everything has been taken away. The movie is telling you that the difference between those two versions of him is not superhuman strength. It is awareness. It is choice. It is the decision to stop sleepwalking. And if there is one detail, one line, one visual joke, or one hidden piece of foreshadowing that you notice only after watching the film again, share it below. Because the best thing about a movie this carefully constructed is that the conversation never really ends when the credits roll. If this deep dive made you see Shaun of the Dead differently, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and joining us for the next cinematic breakdown. Because there are countless films we think we already understand simply because we have seen them before. Sometimes all it takes is one closer look to discover that the story was hiding something much deeper in plain sight. And maybe that is the final joke Shaun of the Dead leaves us with: the zombies were never the only ones who needed to wake up.